30%. 30%, which even their own reports are saying have no economic costs to the European Union and actually don't drive the transformation that is needed at the European level. Because they have managed to make sure that they have so many loopholes that actually, in real terms, the European emissions can actually increase in the second commitment period. The third major thing that they said there was, well, at least on climate finance we saw some progress. Actually, we saw very little progress. Yes, we saw Green Climate Fund agreed. It's an empty fund. That's what was agreed. An empty fund that they don't even want to talk about how they're going to put the money in until 2020. They don't want to talk about where that money is going to come from until 2020. But what they did manage to do was make sure that they have a window in there where multinationals will be able to access the money that's in the Green Climate Fund for their actions on reducing emissions globally. So what we see here is really a fundamental setback. And you have to say, why are we failing? Is it because we just don't have the reports? We don't have the analysis? We could fill St. Paul's Cathedral with the amount of reports that are out there that are telling us what the impacts of the science are out there. We don't need to know now. We can see it. 2011, we saw the reality, as Helena said, about the floods, the fires, the droughts that are devastating the world. Even in the midst of the Durban talks, floods in Durban killed 8 people in the townships. The reality of the impacts was so open and clear for people to see. And yet, governments are unable to act. And that, I think, comes back to our issue. I hear a lot of people talk about climate justice. I hear many, many people say we're in favour of climate justice. I think maybe they mean a different thing when they talk about climate justice than what we mean about climate justice. When we talk about climate justice, it's not about just solving the climate crisis. It's also about solving the economic crisis, the social justice crisis, the democracy crisis. Because ultimately, all of these issues are at play when we talk about the sort of world and the transformation that we need. And what I find particularly sick and sad whilst we were in Durban was people talking about, well, we've still got a chance to keep to a 2-degree world. We know what the science is telling us. 2 degrees is devastating for the world, and particularly for Africa, where temperatures rise at a much higher level, where it will be 3.5 degrees warming in Africa. And at 2 degrees, as Archbishop Tutu said, it will incinerate Africa. It will lead to the collapse of over 50% of Africa's agriculture. So we know the reality, and we know the challenges. And then we look at what are being put forward as the solutions. And the big push by the European Union, the big push by our government. That voice is not. Mike's not. My voice hasn't gone. I'm going. Okay, I've done it. I am right into the mic, sorry. Okay, right into the mic. But I've been told to wind up, so I'm going to wind up. But I'm going to say that there were some positives also in Durban. The positives were not just that we were bringing the inspiration of the Occupy movement and the amount of our movements there in Durban that looked to the Occupy movement and said, this is the beginning of the change. This is us revisioning the world. This is us re-engaging. And not just in the global south, but here in the north where we have responsibility. Where we have too long have sat quiet. The movements in the south are strong, are growing. And the question they always ask to us is, when are you going to be on the street? When are you going to challenge power? Because we are challenging power. We are challenging the oil companies, the coal companies, the mineral companies. We are challenging the exploitation of our natural resources. We are trying to challenge the financial companies that are trying to rape and pillage our environment. But you, in the global north, when are you going to stand up and talk about the fact that this system isn't delivering, not just for us, but for you as well? And I heard an ambassador in the climate talks who said that the only solution to the climate crisis is to occupy the COP. And I thought, when you hear ambassadors saying that the only solution is to occupy the COP, and we did, maybe not for long, but we did have an Occupy the COP in Stand Up for Africa. And yes, we were outside on the COP with an Occupy Square, and we did have thousands of people marching, but we didn't have millions of people marching, and we didn't have so much pressure, because the reality is this: we are not going to see action inside the COP negotiations. The best we can do, the best all of us who are involved in the negotiation can do, is try and slow down their shit. Is try and put some more obstacles in their way. But fundamentally change? No. That will only happen when we have the power outside of the COP. When we are in millions outside of those COP. When we can hold our politicians accountable. When we can take on the corporations who have so much control in there. And you heard about the thousands, and I'm talking about the thousands of corporate lobbyists who are inside the negotiations, who are on government delegations, and both developed but also developing countries. But there are real signs and there are challenges. The movements that are building in the south around energy, I've been told to around energy, and I think that's really key. Because sometimes people talk about renewable energy, and it's yes, we need to see the transformation around renewable energy. But it's not just about making sure we've got renewable energy. We've got to make sure we've got affordable energy. We've got energy access. But it's no good just having power lines. People have got to be able to afford the energy. And in South Africa, where you do have energy, primarily for the industrial complex, the thousands and millions of people don't have access to that energy. And that's why our struggles here against the big six energy companies, about transforming our energy mix, about our energy sector, has to be connected with the struggles for people all around the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Alfred. Right, finally, we're going to get some questions in a minute, but before we just get into the questions. Before we get into the questions, we've got our very own George Barder, who many of you will know here. George has been an occupier here since right at the beginning, and very involved with also environmental activism. George.
Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a sort of scattershot approach, because I think we're going to go into a discussion pretty soon. But I'm going to stand up so I can shout. Can everyone hear me at the back? Max, can you hear me? Okay, there we go, that'll do. So yeah, just following on from what everybody has said, what does this all mean in broad brush? We can't transform the world's energy systems in the next 5 years without some kind of global agreement. I imagine most people here would agree with the principle of subsidiarity, which is that where possible you do things at the most local level, but dealing with climate is clearly something that has to be dealt with at a global level. But as we've just heard from Assad and others, the UN process at the moment is an absolute load of shit, and I think that's the only appropriate way to put it. There are no legally binding commitments. This is what's been achieved sort of since up to Copenhagen and since. There are no legally binding commitments in the international agreement. There are no science-based targets. This is complete insanity everywhere you look. There's been a complete removal basically of equity and historic responsibility from the UNFCCC process, which was there in the original Kyoto Agreement. The reason people talk about Kyoto as if it was a good thing was because in principle it talked about a number of things that should have been included in the deal. Even Kyoto though was an absolute load of shit, because the numbers of reductions that the rich countries were meant to make were far too small, and they're basically unenforceable. There's basically no compliance mechanism at all. So the point here is we do have a framework in terms of the basic ideas included in Kyoto, that those who caused the problem should be responsible, that the solution should be based on what the science says we actually have to do. It should be based on, not just who's responsible, but who has the money to pay for it, and that happens to be the same group. What they've also done recently is basically remove the difference between the rich countries that have caused the problem and the poor ones that haven't. People talk about India and China doing more now than they did, and that's certainly true. And if the rich world doesn't do what it needs to and actually support the difference in the cost between fossil fuels for the poor world and renewables, which is what they should be doing, of course we're going to have more and more of a problem coming out of India and China. But when you look at the increases between 1990 and 2007, for instance, India's increase adds 1% roughly, or less, to its overall historic responsibility for the problem. China, up 2% to its overall historic responsibility. That massive growth over 17 years. It's only added a tiny percentage to the amount it's actually responsible for the problem. So this is still very much our problem. And this brings me on to the media problem. And George, I think, is about the best person in the world that I know of in terms of actually exposing, without any frills, quite how much of a problem we have in terms of the 1% paying for the information that comes to us. And it's more even than the information. The 1% get to construct what reality is in our heads and hearts most of the time. And it's not, when we look at information, we're focusing at a sort of superficial analytic level. What the 1% are doing are telling us the stories of how life is and how we should see ourselves. And fundamentally they make us see ourselves as individuals rather than as part of a collective. And even talking to people who are really upset about climate, and the economy and all these things, when you talk to people they say things like, oh, it's so good what you're doing in Occupy, and I hope you guys are successful. And for so many people, even when they understand in theory what the problem is, there's this big barrier between seeing themselves as they've been taught to as an isolated individual, one amongst 6 billion that can't make a difference, and somebody that can start seeing themselves as part of an empowered collective. And I think that's what this movement has to make no bones about the need for doing, just inspiring people to understand their lives and their role in the world differently. Okay, shit, I'm running out of time. Okay, I'm just going to race through a few things. So yeah, we have to be able to, we need the UNFCCC process we're screwed, but as Assad said, without millions of people pushing for that, there's no way we're going to win it. I think rather than focusing on the right wing, who just doesn't get this, who increasingly doesn't get it for ideological identity reasons and therefore is less and less likely to get it in the next few years, instead of focusing on the unconverted, we need to focus on the fact that the converted are plenty to form a critical mass for this movement already. But the converted spend too much time worrying about how they're not going to persuade the rest of the unconverted, and one of the side effects of that is they're not looking at how they, the so-called converted, are not singing from the same hymn sheet. NGOs have a massive role to play in this. The likes of Assad and Pasco here, I know, are fighting their corner in organisations that tend to want to stick with sort of friendly narratives that appeal to sort of small middle class changes that people can make in their lives, rather than seeing the problem we have. So. Okay, so a couple of other things just aren't in the UNFCCC thing. There's no principle of loss of damage. Okay, 2 minutes. So the World Bank lent more in fossil fuels, $4.7 billion in 2010 than it ever has. It increased its its coal spending by 256% in that 1 year alone. The people at the middle are driving this problem and making it far worse, exponentially worse. Going back to what our friend from the Green Party said, we mustn't be scared off by these very well designed sort of propaganda ideas like doom-mongering. You tell people how bad it really is, and i.e. you tell people how alarming it really is and they call you alarmist. We need to stand up against that. The bell's serving. Last two things. We need also to be very careful not to get so preoccupied with climate that we miss the fact that this is part of a variety of converging crises. And while people still throw climate denial at you, pretty much nobody can deny that the crisis we have in our oceans, the crisis we have with topsoil, the crisis we have with fossil water, we have an economic system that is destroying the world at exponentially increasing rates. And unless we get together, a few million of us across the world, and that's all it will take, actually singing from the same hymn sheet, then we're not going to have a chance. And for anyone who hasn't read, on climate and media, I would recommend anything by George that people haven't read already. Go to his website. The other thing I would beg anybody who hasn't read to read is Capitalism versus the Climate by Naomi Klein. And the point that she makes, and I will end on this, the point that she makes is that the right wing has caught on in the last few years to the fact that climate change means that all the things that progressives have been fighting for pretty much over the last 10, 20 years have to be done to have any chance of pretty much surviving with life as we know it. So climate is the great unifying factor. For anyone who's here kind of for the economy and they're interested in climate but thinks the two are kind of separate, unless we get on this unified narrative about how it's the neoliberal system that is the problem, that is run by the 1%, that destroys democracy, that destroys the planet, and that when we look at what we need to do with climate and the environment, we have a practical template for what we actually need to do. And then the last thing I'm going to mention is, if we were to be remotely successful in this, and it looks incredibly unlikely, but because it's so important, we have to aim for it at every moment. The key thing is what I call poaching, i.e. understanding that any attempt at reform will be taken over by the powerful wherever possible, and will also be hollowed out of substance. And it's those two things that matter. People talk about climate as if kind of, oh well, if the fossil fuel companies get in on the action, isn't that kind of unfair because they've, in terms of solving the problem, isn't that kind of unfair because they've caused the problem? This is not the problem we have to worry about. As soon as the powerful economically get their hands on any of these attempts to change things, they stop them having an effect. You've seen it with international aid, where our aid money basically goes to British consultancies. Okay, very quickly, you've seen it with the economic crisis, where, okay, I'm really coming to the end. Okay, 15 seconds, 3 examples of poaching, because it's really important. The economic stimulus, hundreds of billions of dollars to stimulate the economy, has done nothing but enrich the people at the top. Poverty, like I say, climate is the arch example of poaching. We've got 1,000 different things that are being done to solve the climate, and they're actually being used as a new green colonialism. And here is the most evil thing that I think I've come across in the last few months, which is many people in this, I'm finishing the sentence. People in this movement, this is very important, I'm sorry. People in this movement, many have come to me and said they don't believe in climate change, and the reason is because they're being sold the real story of what the powerful are doing as a response to climate change, to basically get more power for themselves, as an excuse for not believing climate change is happening.
Great, thank you very much, George. Right, yeah. Hate having to butt in and silence somebody, but I think it is really important that everybody here gets the chance to speak. When you organise this kind of thing, you invite lots of people, and then you think, with the fact in mind that 1 or 2 might not turn up, but everybody turned up, and then somebody else said they'd like to come as well. So, are there any questions?
Thank you very much, Peter. My name is Melanie. I'm very involved in an organisation called Wildlaw UK, which is about trying to recognise the rights of nature in law. I'm also very heavily involved in the Energy, Equity and Environment Working Group. My question to the speakers really is to do with the World People's Conference on Climate Change and the Rights of Mother Earth, which I hope you're aware of. It was a big world conference that was organised following the total farce of Copenhagen in 2009. The conference took place in April 2010 and 35,000 people attended. Now, there were lots of really important outcomes of that conference, including calls for really serious emissions reductions. One of the main outcomes though was a proposed text called the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth. Now this text it's a blueprint for a better society. It's about respecting life, and Bolivia and the Latin American countries, they are the 99%. I believe they are leading the way, and I wondered, given that no one spoke about this, and I think it's really, really significant, what people on the panel think about it.
Great, thanks very much, Mel. Can I just ask questioners, because we do have limited time, and members of the panel to keep their interventions brief, please. Thank you very much. Who would like to address Melanie's point there? What?
You're absolutely right. The Cochabamba People's Agreement, I think, was really, really important. Not only because it allowed the movements to reframe the debate, particularly after the disaster of Copenhagen. And I think there was lots and lots of very, very important issues in there about a blueprint, about how we need to build the movements both outside and inside, some of the principles, and some really interesting ideas. I think the rights of Mother Earth, I mean, and the challenges that come along with that. And I think we're at the start of that conversation. And Bolivia is clearly, they've instigated it, but that's come from the movements in Bolivia. And I think it's the start of a global conversation. So I'm of course, we as Friends of the Earth, and many of our groups in particularly in Latin America, are very, very involved in the Cochabamba People's Agreement. And I think it's a debate, you know, it's a really debate. But there are some challenges, I mean, real challenges, you know, even for Bolivia, where you see for Bolivia, for example, one of the poorest countries in the world, and it has got the rights of the Mother Earth now in the convention, but still is exploiting natural resources, of course, to deal with poverty. So how do we build an alternative world, an alternative country, in that within a dominant economic system? And I think some of those challenges are what we need to think through. And that's where, again, where the Occupy and I think the Climate Justice Agreement come together.
I participated in the agriculture group in that, and from a distance, I didn't go, but I think one of the really extraordinary things to remember is that in Latin America, small farmers, indigenous people, produce an enormous amount of the food there, and they do that through their knowledge of Mother Earth, through their traditional knowledge. They keep their particular seeds, they exchange them, they have extraordinary knowledge which many of us can only just imagine. And this is a vital part of the whole thing of the rights of Mother Earth. And that is the beginning of how do we, as people, with all our habits and our egotism and our demands and all the things that have been manufactured in our heads that we've been hearing about, how do we really live with Mother Earth in such a way that we don't destroy everything around us? And I do think that some of those discussions around agriculture were some of the beginnings of that.
Yeah, certainly we've become very disconnected from nature, and there's a growing international mobilisation to try and consolidate some of these people's agreements like the Cochabamba one, and also the Earth Charter, which was written to kind of show an alternative, into some kind of hard law. At the moment they're sort of functioning in some groups as a sort of soft law, but there's a campaign that's just starting called Eradicating Ecocide, which is hoping to move these people's agreements into the higher legal circles internationally, so that actually we can begin to enforce penalties on bad practices and incur fines where fines are due, for instance, for devastation of the Amazon rainforest, or for oil spills, or for other environmental destruction.
That moment after Copenhagen, I think, was a very, very important moment, and I think that what was organised in Bolivia was a real sign of what we could do and where we could go, both in terms of the content of what was debated. It was not just about how we can live more sustainably as humans, as part of the planet, but it was also a challenge, a direct challenge to the process and the priorities of Copenhagen. And I was actually quite excited, temporarily I was quite excited after Copenhagen, because they were so clearly exposed. And actually the protests in Copenhagen have been inspiring, absolutely inspiring. The moment afterwards in Bolivia was absolutely inspiring. I think just one thing though is I do feel that the environmental movement, if we want to use that word, very much lost its way after Copenhagen, and I think we have to regain that momentum. Something went wrong, some reason people got confused, disorientated, I don't know, whatever. But it is, whatever wasted time that we've had from Copenhagen to now, we have to put an end to that and now take the